So then we have in the Nyingma teachings the 9 yanas. And there's a similarity. You can draw correspondence, but the most important thing is to know that each one of these, just like the elements go from the most dense of form, earth, to water, to fire, to air, it gets more and more subtle, and then all of that is arising within space. Within the yanas, it goes from the most dense, the most limited, to the most vast and limitless. And so there is this progression. We go from the 2 Hinayana paths of the path of the Shravaka and the Pratyeka Buddha. Both of those paths have to do with liberating the self. Just the self. So there's a very strong belief and reinforcement of the self. The Shravakas renounce the world, and through discipline and detachment, they attain a state of separation from the outer world. And through that, they believe they can overcome the self. They know there's this connection between the self and the world, the self in here and the world out there. So if they feel that if they can separate themselves from the world out there, then they can isolate the self in here and it becomes controllable. If you avoid things to be attracted to, if you avoid things to be averse from, then you can control the self and you can be free of suffering. Then the Pratyeka Buddhas actually kind of work through the levels of self. They work through the 12 links of interdependent origination backwards till they get past where the self begins. So they work their way back, contemplating all these 12 links of origination until they get before the self. And they see through the self that way. But they do it off in a cave, off on retreat, again, separate from the world. And they do it to liberate themselves. So those are both Hinayana paths because they're about self-liberation. Then the Mahayana is about total liberation, which means liberation of all beings that we think are out there, as well as the self that we think is in here. So in Mahayana, we try and dissolve this wall that separates self from other. And we try and do it by overcoming the habit of considering the self most important. And the way we do that is we always put others first, to raise others above ourselves, and to put others before ourselves in a way so that we, not through denying the self, but through working for the benefit of others, forget the self. We throw ourselves into compassion for other beings and their suffering. We recognize the suffering of other beings. We realize, why should I try and liberate myself all by myself when all these other beings are suffering? So it's like the difference between Hinayana and Mahayana is if this room caught on fire and you went running out the door to escape, that's Hinayana. Mahayana is if you're like, let me help the most infirm person out first. If there was somebody in here in a wheelchair, or somebody who had a bum leg, or somebody who was not aware there was a fire, you help them out first. Like in a plane when they say, put the mask on yourself first before you do it on a child, Mahayana is the opposite of that. You put the mask on the child first, and then yourself. So you put all others before you. That's the essence of Mahayana. And through Mahayana, you start to expand the mind. Through putting others before yourself, you start to expand the mind because the teachings start to indicate that there are countless others. There's only one self. There's only one you. There are countless millions of others. So you lose yourself in the ocean of other beings who are suffering. And you understand they're suffering because you suffer. You suffer from having things you don't want. You suffer from wanting things you don't have. So whenever you see somebody suffering, you can relate to it. By experiencing your own suffering and looking at it and examining it, you can relate to every other being that suffers because they too have things they don't want and want things they don't have. So you practice the 6 perfections. You put others before self. And you let your mind expand into the reality, the truth, that there are countless beings. There are countless beings waiting to be helped. Countless beings that don't see how to escape suffering. So if you have any insight into it, that's who you need to help. So the mind starts to really expand in the Mahayana. So the first level of Mahayana is the path of the Bodhisattva. That's the 3rd yana. So the first yana is the Shravaka, Second yana is the Pratyeka Buddha. Third yana, Bodhisattva. It's the beginning of the Mahayana. Bodhisattva is on their way to Buddhahood because they're forgetting the self, putting all others before the self.